Welcome everybody to Highside, Lowside. My name is Zack. I'm joined as always by my buddy Spurg. And on today's program, we're talking about alternate motorcycle timelines. What if Germany had won the war? What if Boeing made motorcycles? What if Harley-Davidson was a completely different company? Plus airbag data from my accident in Spain. We're circling back to that. And did you know that flippable tire technology does exist? All that and much, much more, everybody, after a quick word from our sponsor, Motul.
We talk a lot about changing your motorcycle oil in these Motul ads, and of course Motul has you covered with a full line of synthetic and semi-synthetic oils for your motorcycle. But what about changing your coolant? It is important that every few years you're flushing out your coolant system. And luckily for you, Motul has you covered with a coolant radiator cleaner as well as high quality expert antifreeze. You want to check out the full line of Motul cleaners and coolants over on RevZilla.com/Motul. That's RevZilla.com/MOTUL. And when you're over there on RevZilla.com, just keep in mind that every time you make a purchase with RevZilla, a little bit of that money goes back into funding the programs that you enjoy. Whether it's Zack and I sitting here talking with you on Highside, Lowside, or the shenanigans that people get into when you're out riding for a CTXP episode, or maybe you just appreciate the gear reviews and the product information. RevZilla gives back to riders because that's who we all are. Riders. So keep that in mind next time you need to make a purchase for your motorcycle. From cruisers to sport bikes to adventure bikes and everything in between, we've got you covered at RevZilla.com.
Welcome again, everybody. High side, low side. We're off on another journey. Just the two of us here today. Spurg, no guest, but still plenty of stuff to say, I'm sure. We are going to start, we don't like to sprint off into a high side, low side episode without stretching out a little bit, warming up. And, this time the warm up is near and dear to my heart, Spurjo.
So at the time of recording, we are coming hot off a weekend of Supercross kicking off, out in Anaheim. And the big news after the weekend, was Justin Barcia, who's racing for Ducati this year, had a pretty gnarly crash where he and Malcolm Smith collided. And
Malcolm Stewart.
I'm sorry, Malcolm Stewart.
Yeah.
And
Malcolm Smith, R.I.P.
It's true. It's true. That's sort of my mind is all over the place. We're getting some deep history in today's episode. But yes, and was wearing an Alpinestars Tech Air MX, was rushed off to the hospital. And while he's beat up and bruised, he seems to have walked away relatively unscathed at this time. And we were talking with Alpinestars about this, but it got us, thinking about the fact that, as this technology continues to evolve, one of the interesting pieces of this is that you do get, more information about the crash and how it happened and all of that. And Zack, you were wearing an Alpinestars Tech Air 7, I believe, during your crash. You have since received some data from Alpinestars.
Yes.
And so this segue about Justin Barcia and his crash is the perfect, little kind of jaunt into what have you learned that you might not have known otherwise about, your crash and help the audience understand that.
Yes, I think we promised or suggested that we would follow up after the episode about my crash, about if and when we got Alpinestars Tech Air data. We did. It's pretty interesting. I should say right out of the gate here that one of the reasons that I am fortunate to call riding motorcycles my job is that I get to have access to Alpinestars Tech Air data. Not everyone can do this. In other words, Spurg, yet anyway, you can't just send in your airbag after a crash and say like, hey, Alpinestars, give me that one of those nifty Marc Marquez printouts where you show me what the maximum G load was and how long I tumbled for and blah, blah, blah. But because we work at RevZilla and I was working when I crashed, I was able to have access to that information, which is kind of cool. And so I got a readout of what the accelerometers said inside the Tech Air system. And I wrote an article about it. is on the Common Tread website, where I analyzed some of the onboard video, which is a part of the article as well, and showed the airbag data and sort of cross-referenced those things along with the damage to my gear, to my helmet, to my leathers, to my gloves, to my boots, and try and figure out exactly how I hit the ground and why my injuries happened, and other reasons to be grateful. And as a little nugget, I pulled some airbag data from a Marc Marquez crash, of which there is video on YouTube, embedded that in the article as well. So you can sort of see, it was interesting for me, perhaps more than anyone else, to sort of like visualize what the crash looked like. Like it was comparable data from a Marc Marquez crash of like, his maximum impact with the ground and how long he tumbled after he crashed. And in my mind, I was sort of like, I don't really know what any of that looked like or felt like because we don't have it on video.
I would say for the audience, there was no actual video of your crash,
no,
correct?
Right. No trackside video. There was an onboard of the bike, which we can analyze and we can learn some stuff from the way the bike tumbled, but I didn't actually see what happened to me and my body, which, no offense to KTM, was what I was most concerned with.
So, I mean, outside of, folks, leaving the podcast and go reading the article, what was your biggest takeaway from taking a look at the data? What did you learn? What was your number one piece of information?
Good question. I don't know. I mean, I think, I guess part of it is when I saw like my data chart says, the section where I quote unquote tumbled on the track, like, I was airborne for a little while and I hit the ground. And then the time from when I hit the ground to when I ended up still in the gravel trap was, let's see, 3.45 seconds. So 3.5 seconds of tumbling. And you sort of like, I don't know. It doesn't seem like that long. 3.5 seconds isn't that long.
Did it feel like longer to you in the moment?
Well, I don't remember it. So that's another reason that analyzing this data was interesting, because I hit my head hard enough that I don't really remember tumbling at all. But then the Marc Marquez crash, I believe he tumbled for 3.55 seconds or 3.58 seconds or something, whatever, within a few hundredths of a second of my tumbling total. In other words, from the time that he hit the ground to when he came to a stop was a similar amount of, sliding and tumbling down the track. And when I watch the video of him doing it, I'm like, that looks like it sucks. And so like, it looks like a long time, it looks like he slid and tumbled for a long time. You're sort of like, oh, okay, well, that changes your perspective a little bit on what you, how I felt about it. Like, part of me was like, I broke my ankle and I cracked a bone in my neck, but like, am I just a wuss, or should I feel like, do I get to feel tough after having survived this, and then watching his crash, which had a similar maximum load impact, from the airbag system and also a similar amount of tumbling. Obviously every crash is different for loads and loads of reasons, right? But it was a little bit of an illustration for me. And I was kind of like, wow, that was a longer crash than I thought it was, I guess.
So forgive me if you answered this and I just missed it. Did Alpinestars provide you that specific Marquez crash because the data was similar to yours?
No, I looked it up.
You did. Okay.
Because I was curious, right? Like I think anyone would say like, oh, I know that I crashed at approximately this speed, whatever. I had an onboard camera on my bike and like I crashed in third gear at 65 miles an hour. And so I don't know, like, and the bike slid for this X amount of time. And so like, I guess I'm just like curious what that looks like. What does that even look like? Like I don't really know what a 65 mile an hour Highside looks like, but you can, because we live in the age of the internet and YouTube and whatever, you can look it up and be like, what does it look like when someone Highsides at 65 or 70 miles an hour? Well, okay, cool. Now I can watch that. And I don't know, like I said, perhaps other people won't be quite as interested in it as I am, but, analyzing all the data that I had and combining it with things that I knew or inferred, was super interesting to digest it all. And, I don't know if it really provides any kind of closure for me at all, but it was also made me, I don't know if it made me feel better. I wasn't expecting to find, that Marquez crash data where he hurt himself and I hurt myself. And I thought like, well, at least if a once in a generation rider that's made out of pure muscle and talent gets hurt when he crashes at that approximate speed or whatever, then like, maybe I don't feel so bad having a flabby dad bod that rides a desk for a living. You know what I mean? That's all.
Well, I think there's a lot of outside benefits with the airbag technology that we're seeing from Alpinestars, specifically because there are accelerometers, there are gyroscopes. They're collecting this data. And like Zack said, not all of this data is accessible to the average consumer, but within the Alpinestars app, you can track things like maximum speed and lean angles and other pieces of information. So
track your ride and stuff.
Yeah, it's much more than just safety technology. There's a lot of overall technology that goes into this stuff. And if you want to learn more about it, we have plenty of articles on Common Tread. We've got videos breaking the technology down. And there's no shortage of rabbit holes you can jump into with trying to figure out.
Agreed. Hopefully, if you have time to check out that article, you'll get a kick out of it. But Spurjo, moving on from my crash data, and on to this episode. This is a listener suggestion.
Today's episode is a listener suggestion from a longtime listener named Jay.
Longtime listener Jay, self-described, quote unquote, longtime listener, sent us a note that said, I would like to pitch an episode involving motorcycles, alternate timelines. Excuse me. Can the crew dive into this world of hypotheticals? I think it would be a fun episode. So what this means basically is, as we talked about briefly in the intro, what if this happened? What if that happened? What if this company did that? What if that country won the war? What if this company went out of business? Whatever. We chewed it over in a production meeting with our fearless leader, Chase, and came up with a few topics to cover here. And I think we're going to have a fun conversation. So I'll let you kick it off, Spurjo.
Yeah. So what we did was we had Chase reach out to other members of the team, and they all proposed what they would like to hear chewed over. And the first one actually comes in from our editor, Matt. And editor Matt says, what if American heavy industry companies made the variety of products that Japanese industrial countries do? So for example, like Kawasaki doesn't just make motorcycles. It's a heavy industries company. They make all kinds of crazy stuff. Honda's launching rockets and, running an automotive wing. And, so what we did was we took Matt, gave us a whole slew of suggestions of like, what if, Ford did blah, 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 blah. Well, the one that we liked was, would you ride a Boeing motorcycle in 1975? What if Boeing made motorcycles in 2025? And we thought this was pretty cool to think about the aeronautical space and the automotive space. And so, Zack, who did you reach out to get their take on this? Because that's the other point too, is that we actually reached out to other people in the industry to help us answer these questions.
Yes, we did. So each of these answers will have Spurge and I, chewing the fat on what we think happened, but we reached out to someone else in our network of quote unquote motorcycle experts to give us their take so that we're not the only ones in the room here. So you'll see some names you recognize as we move along here. I reached out to my former boss at Motorcyclist Magazine, Mr. Mark Cook, who now works in the general aviation publishing industry, has done and did for a while before riding motorcycles. He's pretty well versed in the world of aviation. And so we asked him what his take on Boeing. He's not an industrial, an American industrial economic historian or anything like that. He just sort of knows a bit about airplanes. And he gave us some interesting stuff to chew over. And I guess I'm not sure where to start exactly. But I thought it was interesting that our buddy Mark's take on this was that it was not, to me, like when I saw this question asked by editor Matt, he was sort of like, what if Boeing had gotten into riding motorcycles? And I was sort of like, yeah, I don't know. Seems like Boeing would have lots of strength in engineering. They'd have lots of footholds in, I don't know, material design and so on and so forth. And like, getting into motorcycles at some point wouldn't be that big a stretch, Right. But interestingly, especially in the modern era, especially since, I guess, the 70s or certainly since the jet age, Mark's take was sort of like aviation at the scale that Boeing operates on and motorcycling are just so different that there wouldn't be enough crossover for anything exciting to have ever come out of that hypothetical situation. Is that what you read into it also?
Yeah, he talks about, the FAA would have, lots of, regulations never before tried technology. He talked about, one of the ways that Boeing saw success was through, underpinned government military contracts, right? So like a lot of what they were able to develop was done because they were, creating planes for military use first that then transitioned over into consumer use, right? So
right.
That was kind of like how I heard him think about this.
He also pointed out that he had a line in his response to us that I liked, where he said, virtually every company that has come into aviation intending to revolutionize it, or to prove that the old guard was out of touch, or to prove that they were smarter, has failed. And he points out that like all jets look the same, all general aviation planes look the same. It's because the design has been sorted out, and that's where it's all settled. And that's kind of the end of it. He did point out that there are disruptors in the like vertical takeoff and landing space, and this sort of like gap between recreational drone aircraft and things that can carry people, and it's sort of being bridged in a way that's a little spooky sometimes. Anyway, there's lots of cool stuff happening in the aviation world. Not that doesn't happen, but on a grand scale, and for like a big business trying to make a big impact in another industry, it sounded like his viewpoint was that it was too narrow a silo to escape, basically, which I thought was kind of interesting.
Mark,
but I know that you have an alternate take here, Spurg.
Mark, I
understand.
I'm a huge fan of your work. I've gotten to work with Mark on a few projects. I like Mark. I'm disappointed, Mark. Your imagination wasn't broad on this. So let's put the history teacher cap on here, Mr. Dunbar.
Tell us, Mr. Dunbar. Tell us all about Boeing.
Boeing's first jet engine came around in the 50s. It was a turbojet for their 707s. You know who made and produced one of the engines? Like, because Boeing sourced outside producers for their engines. Do you know who made one of those engines, Zach?
Harley-Davidson.
No.
Okay.
Rolls-Royce. Okay.
Rolls-Royce.
So Rolls-Royce is an automotive company, but they're also making aeronautical engines. You know what Rolls-Royce also produced a turbo for? A jet turbine engine?
Oh, the Y2K motorcycle.
The MTT, the marine turbine engines. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. The turbine engines from the early 2000s were powered by a Rolls-Royce 250 C18 gas turbine engine.
This is the wacky, perhaps we can show it on screen at some point, the wacky turbine jet-powered motorcycle that I think Jay Leno famously had one of and rode around a little bit. Wacky motorcycle. But your point is that Rolls-Royce, like a supplier for Boeing and for motorcycles. Is that what you're saying here?
Yeah. And so what I'm trying to figure out here is that, like, I'm not big into the world of aviation, but I did some research here, and like in the world of 7 Degrees of Kevin Bacon, like it only took, 2 lines to connect these dots
slices
together.
of bacon.
Exactly.
To get
I like bacon. So I'm going to keep us on track though, because bacon can easily derail us. But my point being is that, like, okay, if Boeing were a bit more imaginative in like, hey, we're sticking these engines on things that fly and we are, building planes. Why not think about this from a more consumer facing standpoint? Maybe to Mark's point, from a scale of economies, that didn't make sense. But then let's fast forward and let's think about this outside of jets, to Mark's additional point of, like, there is some experimenting happening right now. There was an article that was produced by Dustin Whelan literally today at the time of recording.
It's a brand new article. I probably haven't even seen it yet.
I know. I'm hopped up on Red Bull. I've been working since like 6 a.m. this morning. So Dustin released an article called "The Motorcycles of CES 2026, Solid State Batteries and Other Flying Bikes." So flying personal aircraft is big right now. I was actually listening to an investment podcast a few days ago where they were talking about, some of these companies that are trying to get capital to create aircraft that could potentially replace helicopters. And the what Dustin gets into in his article is EVTOL, which is electronic vertical takeoff and landing. These are small aircraft that can take off vertically, fly, and then vertically land. So think like a helicopter, but a little bit more looks like a flying motorcycle. Now, do I think that this is going to take off necessarily from an individual case, being that the company LEO is recommending a base price of $100,000 for their flying motorcycle thingy? No, I don't think this is going to be a fly-by-night thing. But to imagine a world where this doesn't become something that we see more of in the next, 10 or 15 years with the rapid success of technology. I'm just disappointed there's not more of an imagination for Marc about like where Boeing's going to come into play here.
In his defense, a jet-powered motorcycle I think has been proven at this point to be not a very good idea, and not one that had mass appeal from a financial standpoint or a practical standpoint. You don't want 420
horsepower underneath you in a jet engine? Come on.
No, I mean,
with a red line of 52,000 RPM.
Right. Yeah, I think in Marc's defense, that's exactly the kind of crap that Boeing wanted to avoid in getting into the motorcycle industry. But I did also, you bring up an interesting point, which is the whole VTOL space, personal VTOL or eVTOL aircraft, which, to be clear, I don't know a lot about, so I'm not going to pretend I do. But they're very sophisticated electronically, right? It was like 15 years ago, or so, I'm totally making this up, that we started seeing those little recreational drones that you could fly around your living room that had automatic, it's every drone shot that you see on the news or on a YouTube video or whatever is shot out from a DJI or some sort of recreational drone that you can get. And the way those drones fly is you can control when they go up or down or left or right or sideways, but they self-balance, right? So self-balancing drone technology has been around in the recreational, especially in the camera space, for a while now, right?
Yeah.
Or not I'm a decade and a half anyway. It's what sort of I feel like 15 years ago is where I remember seeing those for sale cheap and on little kids playing with them at Christmas and stuff like that. Marc made an interesting point, which is that aircraft in the space that Boeing plays in anyway has been pretty old school for a long time. And he pointed out that the 787 Dreamliner that Boeing produced, I don't remember when that came out, but is state of the art in many, many ways. And there's a lot of electronics involved in large aircraft at this point. But he had a line in his note to us that I thought was kind of interesting. Did I save it? Maybe I didn't. Anyway, it was basically something like, I don't see the amount of electronics that are in a Ducati Panigale V4 in general aviation anytime soon. Now, general aviation is different than military contracts with Boeing or airliners that carry hundreds of people across oceans. But it's an interesting thing to consider that while they've produced their first jet in, what was it, the 50s or something, and jet travel, jetliners have become such a ubiquitous part of life in our world that it's not really, it's still based on pretty simple principles of thrust and lift. And it's not about super complex electronic systems that control pitch and yaw and blah, blah, blah until recently. And so I thought that was an interesting point to make, or until relatively recently. And I think that's an interesting point to make in the context of like, why didn't, it seems like a company like that would be up to their elbows in technology and would be able to keep up with motorcycling so easily. But because of whatever it is he mentions, financial arms, he mentions government regulations, whatever it is, they've been steered in two really different directions. That is motorcycling and aircraft.
Well, one of the things that they talked about, or one of the things that Marc made the point on was, obviously the military application of their aircraft and how that helped. We're living in a world where at the time of recording a few days ago, the United States government is talking about, $500 million contracts for increased drone technology research and purchasing, right? So these companies that are producing these drones are now finding military applications. And to the point of, when I was listening to the financial podcast around some of these individual electronic flying personal aircraft, one of the things that they talked about was, it's really going to be, how do you figure out an application that makes sense financially? And that gets back to Marc's point about Boeing. It's probably not going to be flying motorcycles. It would most likely be something that would be a more practical transportation, right? Like when we're talking about the EVTOLs, like how do you turn that into something that has a more widespread application?
So much that's a good segue, Chase Spurgeon, because I think while producer Chase and perhaps you, dear listener, are hoping that we will move on soon, I would like to stay on the topic just a bit longer. Let's go back in time before the 50s. Mm-hmm. This is when I sort of like, when my mind, when to start talking about Boeing and Boeing making motorcycles, where I went was like pre-jet. Because if you've ever read a Kevin Cameron article in Cycle World,
prop planes?
Propeller planes, gas powered, internal combustion airplanes, right? Well, I guess is a turbine internal combustion? It doesn't matter. Let's get bogged down in the things that Zach doesn't know. But if you go back before jet engines, right, in aircraft, because Boeing has been around since the World War I, I think, I don't know, whatever, 19 teens or something like that, more than 100 years, and famously produced lots of really, crucial aircraft in World War II. If you've ever read a Kevin Cameron article in Cycle World, he talks a lot about World War II aviation because they learned a lot. The aviation industry learned a lot about internal combustion in that time because there's a big crossover between industrial advancements and military spending, as we'll talk about later in this program as well. But that to me was the time for Boeing to make a motorcycle. Post World War II, all the sort of like, I don't know, sort of chest thumping, we saved the world, energy around, American industry and beloved companies that created these aircraft that shuttled troops around and whatever. And maybe you're the history teacher. Maybe I'm missing something really huge here, but having learned so much about internal combustion and what the dynamics inside an engine mean for the performance of the engine and the vehicle, it seems like Boeing was in a place then to enter the motorcycling space with some, I don't know, 3-cylinder air cooled thing that take on Indian and Harley. And wouldn't that'd be an American company? You could sink your teeth into that as a 1950s American. Be like, yeah, I'm going to buy a Boeing motorcycle. It's got that, it makes more horsepower than that Harley-Davidson or Indian. I'm going to ride that down to the malt shop with my main squeeze.
Well, I just finished reading, Peter Egan's new book, of which he talks about flight. And he was somebody else that I consider reaching out to for this question, but he and his wife flew around the country on a Piper Cub. And I believe that was a flat 4 engine, or it was,
that sounds right.
So, but produced, 65 horsepower, upgrades up to 85 horsepower. It's an engine where you could imagine it potentially, either powering a small car or a motorcycle, in addition to a plane. So I do agree that as the American manufacturers were probably a little bit more, I don't want to say singular, because there were, two main American manufacturers that really kind of came out with Indian and Harley, as well as some smaller knockoffs, or some smaller brands that maybe didn't succeed and didn't ultimately last. It is interesting that at that time you didn't see, more of the aeronautical space kind of dabbling in both. The Piper Cub was produced, down the road from me here in Pennsylvania. And, it's one of those ones where we actually have the Dirty Dabbers motorcycle dual sport. Uh-huh. We all go up and camp out in the old factory landing grounds of where the Piper Cub was produced.
Interesting.
Fun fact. Yeah.
That is a fun fact. Well, I think that if you know anything about motorcycles or airplanes or history, you will probably be thinking that we have left a lot of gaps in this conversation, and there are many more hypotheticals that could be put forth. If you have one that you want to share with us, send us an email to highside@RevZilla.com. We would love to hear from you. I think we could probably make a whole podcast out of just that one topic, Spurge, but we'd better move on, don't you think?
Yes, because we've got more topics that are interesting and exciting. This one actually came in. This was one of the topics that longtime listener Jay proposed to us. And he said, what if Harley-Davidson evolved with the industry and made more modern bikes? I would like to start off by saying this was Jay's question. This is as Jay asked it. This is not anything that Zach and I took liberty with.
Right. So if you're a Harley hater, you're going to be thinking, yeah, good question, Jay. Why do they make bikes from 1975 still? Or 1965? Why don't they make new bikes, modern bikes that have new engines, modern engines like everyone else does?
Is that fair, Zach? Is that fair?
Hang on. I'm not done. If you're a Harley lover, you'll be thinking, whoa. Harley has advanced. They have evolved. They have moved forward with all sorts of technology and precision cooling and blah, 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 and ABS and boom, exclamation point boxes. But, I think that the question here is, to distill it a little bit, Spurge, what if Harley-Davidson didn't lean so heavily into heritage and history, and instead just tried to kind of always keep in lockstep with the industry moving forward, with whether it was, sport bikes that were introduced by Japanese companies in the 80s, or adventure bikes as they came to popularity, stuff like that. Like why wasn't there more of that? Which I think is, objectively a fair question.
Yeah. So who did we ask for their opinion?
We went to Mr. Patrick Garvin. Patrick Garvin is our in-house Harley expert and American V-twin expert, I suppose, American flat track expert as well. But the thing about Patrick Garvin that I like so much is that he loves Harley-Davidsons, owns them, works on them, loves them, but he does not drink all of the Kool-Aid. He doesn't have blinders on. Like, he also likes a supercharged Kawasaki ZX-10 now and again. You know what I mean? He's like, he dabbles in everything.
He doesn't only own Harley-Davidsons. He owns a slew of different bikes.
He's got dirt bikes. He's got mini bikes. He's got Japanese bikes, whatever. So I like that about him. And, let's see, I guess, Garvin had a couple of good points when we put this question to him of like, why hasn't Harley evolved differently? And I think the big takeaway for me, what he said, Spurge, was, Garvin said, quote, I think Harley not evolving with the standard motorcycle, quote, culture is the reason they are so successful. And I think that's something that we have to address here, right? Yeah. Is that Harley has been this heritage brand and has really like put a stake in the ground as owning that space, and hasn't let a lot of things derail them. And I think that's a good reason to stay the course, right? Is that it's working.
Well, he also goes on to talk, he gives us some perspective, right? So, he says, it's no secret that Harley-Davidson sells bikes based on a lifestyle, not on a spec sheet, for example.
Yep.
He
also a good point.
He defends the M8 platform, which is much more technologically advanced than previous iterations. I mean, hell, he didn't even bring up the fact that the Revolution Max 1250 that's used in the Pan America and the Sportster is an insanely advanced
engine. Yeah, exactly. No valve adjustments ever.
It revolutionized. I mean, I can't think of another manufacturer that's not, you don't have to adjust the valves, So then he goes on to say, for perspective, Harley-Davidson created the V-Rod, which sold roughly 150,000 units over the life of the model from 2002 to 2017.
Right. So 150,000 models in 15 years.
To put that in perspective, in 2024, Harley-Davidson sold 85,000 touring models in 1 year.
Right. Yeah. Historically, I remember, I think it was 2000, just 2010, 12, 15, somewhere in that range. Harley would sell 50,000 of one model,
right?
Like of a street glide, they'd sell 50,000 of those.
Think about that.
Yeah. And I mean those kind of numbers are staggering. And it is one of the reasons I think it's important to point out why Harley-Davidson has had trouble branching out, whether it's with the V-Rod or the Pan America. I won't say the Pan America. Harley has struggled to create the Pan America or call it a success, but or the XR 1200 famously, it's like they make that bike. If 10 or 15,000 people love that bike, for any other brand, that's a success, right? Like there have been years where BMW has sold 12 or 15,000 flagship GSs. That's great for in the United States. That is, that's great for BMW. They can call that a success. If Harley-Davidson sells 10,000 of a model, it's not that great.
Yeah.
And that is sort of like, it's a tax of the success of the company that they can't, or that it makes less sense to do that kind of thing.
Do you remember, do you have the stats in front of you? I know you wrote an article about Honda. You did a review of the Shadow 750.
Oh yeah.
And so Zach and I were talking in pre-pro. Zach did a review of the Honda Shadow 750. And I bring this up as an example. So in the 80s and into the 90s, you saw Japanese manufacturers, and we'll use Honda as the example here.
Yep.
Branch out and create cruisers to go after the American rider.
Yeah.
And
because Harley was having, I mean, the 70s were not famously good for Harley, but Harley was it was a marquee brand. They're having some success.
And so, when we think about Jay's question, what if Harley-Davidson evolved with the industry and made more modern bikes? Look at a company like Honda, who has all different types of makes and models of motorcycles. And that's kind of, their take on how they're running their company. Zach, what happened when Honda started making cruisers?
It went great. They sold so many of them. I just found my article, and the stats that I had found when I did this, which let's see, compared to the V-twins that America was used to, the Shadow was a technological tour de force. Of course, the quote custom motorcycle scene has always been about looks, but evidently the Shadow had that covered too, because bikes flew out of dealerships and the legend grew immediately. Honda sold more than 19,000 Shadow 750s in the first year of sale, which I think was 83, maybe 82, 83. And by 1985, the cruisers or quote customs in Honda's lineup accounted for nearly 80,000 units per year, which is not nothing. And 80, sales figures in the 80s for motorcycling a little different than sales figures nowadays. But the point is, that's a lot of bikes.
Yeah. And so so I think this gets to the core of Jay's question, where like you look at a brand like Honda and they, maybe took a different approach to what a cruiser was. And some people liked that and bought the bikes, and other people didn't like that. And they kind of stuck with the traditional, Harley-Davidson. Now the pivot here that I want to make.
Oh, I want to pivot. You pivoting before I pivot? Son of a pivot.
Do you want me to let you pivot?
No, you can pivot. Go ahead.
I think the perception here is that Harley-Davidson never tried this, and that's wrong. So Spurgeon puts on his history cap once again, and let me take you back in time to 1960. In 1960, Harley partnered with Aramaki, an Italian manufacturer, and they tried for over 15 years throughout the 60s and 70s to bring in smaller displacement dirt bikes and scooters, and they tried to branch out through what became the AMF years, and ultimately it didn't work out. People didn't buy the bikes. Okay, so that's the first time. Then shortly after the Aramaki partnership ends, Harley introduces the XLCR. Okay, this is a bike produced from 1977 and 1979. This is a cafe racer. They're going after Ducati. They're producing something that's a factory showroom cafe racing motorcycle that you could buy and it does not work out. People do not buy it. And by roughly the end of the 70s, it's gone. You can't walk into a Harley dealership and buy one in 1980. Well, you presumably could buy a leftover because they were still sitting on showroom floors. So
do you know what the sales figures were, Spurge?
No, I did not look that up. But
I don't know. Sometimes you can't find that stuff.
I would assume it was not a lot.
Yeah. But I think, that's they might have sold 25,000 of them. Whereas some Italian or some boutique brand would have been like, wow.
But I think incredible. It's also, you made a good point, like sales numbers in the 70s where, 70s and 80s, we're selling a lot more motorcycles than we are today.
I'm loving your pivot and I don't want to derail it. So continue pivoting.
Harley-Davidson, then in the early 90s, partners with Buell. They basically buy an ownership stake in Buell. They're saying, we're going to build sport bikes. Now, to Jay's point, they're putting Sportster engines in them, but they're putting like hopped up Sportster engines in sport bikes. And they're putting, radial mounted rotors on these crazy American made sport bikes. They did an adventure bike. Like they were doing some interesting stuff and no one was really buying it. Not in volume, not enough to make it succeed, but Harley kept at it. They kept at it from 1993 to 2009 before finally they said, you know what, we're going to cut our losses. I don't have it on here because I failed to find this, but Harley then also had an ownership stake in MV Agusta.
And Cagiva, right, in the 2000s.
Before they sold that. Then let's get forward to 2019. Harley introduces Livewire, a fully electric motorcycle, a relatively sporty fully electric motorcycle. I say relatively sporty. It was not a sport bike, but it could haul the mail. It could snap your neck back at a pretty aggressive pace if you whack that throttle open. That didn't even last that long. They spun Livewire off into its own brand a few years later in 2021. It's still going, and we're going to wait and see what we get from Livewire this year. Mm-hmm. And then in 2021, after they spun off Livewire, they introduced the Pan America, an adventure bike, a revolutionary engine that we already talked about with the 1250 Revolutionary Max, a liquid cooled engine, doesn't need to have the valves adjusted, has variable valve timing. The bike lowered itself in a fully automatic suspension to let you get on and off easier for shorter riders. Like the perception that Harley isn't trying this stuff is wrong. The problem is Harley tries this stuff and it just doesn't work out at an economy of scale that allows them to keep doing it because that's not what Harley buyers want. And for all of us sitting around screaming, give us the Bronx, give us the Bronx. Are you actually going out and spending $15,000 on an American made sport bike?
And right. And more to that point, even if 10 or 12 or 15,000 people put down money and bought a Bronx, would Harley not still, would they not be looking at a spreadsheet and think, well, we sold freaking 38,000 Street Glides and like they're cheaper to make and we didn't have to make new tooling and we just kind of like, I don't know, like why bother? Right. Yep. Like you'd have to ask that question. And I think that's the thing that the sort of like, it seems like Harley's branching out has always been to some extent a victim of the success of all of the sort of bread and butter heritage models.
Yeah. So that was my pivot, Jay. But yeah.
I like your pivot. Your pivot was the same as my pivot, Spurge, except I had a slightly different take.
Okay.
My take was I wrote down the same things you did when I did my research. Aramaki in the 60s, Buell in the 90s, MV Agusta and Cagiva in the 2000s, Livewire in the late 2010s. My imagination went to, if we cast ourselves back to, specifically AMF years, and this isn't a Harley podcast. We're not going to talk about AMF years to too great an extent. If Chase is a really good producer, he will look up exactly which episode that was that we talked about Harley blunders and the AMF years and so on and so forth. And I will circle back to that. But for now, what I'm talking about is this conglomerate of motorcycles that you could see growing over the decades. I think there's something there, right? In the sort of like General Motors, I don't know if General Motors is a great example considering General Motors has, killed off Pontiac and killed off Oldsmobile and so on and so forth.
I'm still bitter about that.
But
I'm holding a grudge, GM.
But I can imagine an alternate reality where Harley-Davidson was this, Harley-Davidson motorcycles were what you imagine Harley-Davidsons to be centrally right now. Street glides, road glides, ultra limited, big top case touring bikes. And then, I guess your soft tails, your heritage classic, that kind of thing. And then within the Harley-Davidson bubble, or maybe we would have called it AMF at this point, whatever, from AMF, you could also get an Aramaki. And an Aramaki, Aramakis are, I don't know, imagine like a, I don't know, some hybrid of imagine like an Aprilia, that kind of thing. Actually, no, better yet, imagine a hybrid between like a Japanese brand, and like a KTM or something like that. So like they're little dirt bikes, they're little scooters, they're little stuff like that. Yeah. And then you got, you could also get a Buell under the AMF umbrella, and Buell, you can get a big, V-twin American superbike if you want, but they also went down the road of creating, a V4, and, you can get an 1100cc V4 with 220 horsepower and 11 levels of traction control and blah, blah, blah. It's basically a Panigale competitor, that kind of thing. And then, with the acquisition of MV Agusta and Cagiva, we have this, you can also get, sort of like sleek and sexy liquid cooled, street bikes to compete with everything from Japan, slightly more up spec and blah, blah, blah. And so you'd have this, like, then you'd have and then electric bikes with live wire, whatever. So then you theoretically have this really complete motorcycle company, right? With dirt bikes that are called Aramakis and sleek, cool little street fighters that are called MV Agustas or Cagivas or something, we don't know. And then, big super bikes that are called Buells, and electric bikes that are called live wires. And then the Harley-Davidson models that we know today as Harley-Davidsons, but it was all part of this company. That was where my mind went with this whole thing, is like a conglomerate in 2025 of all of these things that Harley-Davidson has experimented with and tried to create a whole catalog, and they'd be called different things. They wouldn't all be called a KTM or all be called a BMW, but they would be under the same corporate umbrella.
So as you were going down that pivot, my mind went somewhere else. And this is where I thought you were going to go, and you didn't, but that's okay. And I know that we're going to want to move on. Producer Chase is, pinging us on the side. If you want more information about the Harley-Davidson conversation that Zach was talking to, you can check out the American Blunders, or the Motorcycle Industry Blunders American Edition, Highside, Lowside, season 5, episode 4. But GM specifically, right? One of the things.
Oh, you're gonna air some grievances about
no.
GM
No. Like I want us to think about this, because Harley gets flack from non-Harley owners about like, oh, you're still just building big cruisers, right? Yeah. And they look very similar to the bikes you were building in the 1970s or the 80s, or
right.
Imagine. Let's pretend that GM didn't kill off Pontiac, and imagine that you could buy a GTO, and maybe I'm going over the heads of our younger audience, but like you could get a 60s muscle car that looked like a 60s muscle car, but with a brand new drivetrain and brakes and suspension that actually worked. And like, it's this whole like resto mod, automotive side of things. But like, imagine if that was being done from the factory. So the cars were still boxy and square and made of metal, but they just had modern technology and airbags in them. Like, there's a huge facet of the automotive buyers that would love that, right? And it's the same thing with Harley. Like, GM's not doing that, and people want them to. And then you have Harley-Davidson that's saying, no, like, you can buy a bike that kind of looks pretty similar to the bike that you would have bought,
right,
30 or 40 years ago,
68 or 1978 or whatever.
And I mean, you've seen Triumph have success with this, with their retro, with the modern classic line. Like, I think, when you think about it from that alternate timeline, you wonder why automotive isn't taking a page out of Harley's playbook and whether or not it would be more successful.
I love that you just went full pro Harley on this whole thing. You just like, you ended up just waving the flag, the bar and shield. I like it.
It's an alternate universe, Zach. You never know what you're going to find when you go down one of these wormholes, buddy.
That's true. You found Bizarro Spurge.
Let's get at it, brother.
I think you make a good point. I think it's fair to call out that the perception that Harley has never tried anything is wrong, and I think it's fair to call out that the technological advancements within the motorcycling world do include Harley-Davidson. But at the same time, we both very much understood Jay's question, right?
Yes.
Like when he said, "How come Harley-Davidson hasn't evolved with the industry?" We know what he's asking.
Yeah,
get it.
Takes four fingers to pull the clutch in. You shouldn't have to do that.
All right.
We're having way too much fun with this.
Yep.
We're already 40 something odd minutes into the podcast, and we've got more questions to answer. But let's quickly get in a word from our sponsor, Motul. And there's no alternate universe where Motul's not around and our favorite motorcycle oil. So let's check in with Motul, and we'll be back in a second.
All right, we are flying along here through these list of hypotheticals,
like a Boeing jet through the sky.
The next topic, I think, is the one that really catalyzed this whole episode for us, and the one that we were most excited to, dive into.
Pontificate on?
Sure. You love that word these days.
Have I said it already this podcast?
I can't be sure. You're on so much Red Bull.
Yeah.
The question is, what if Germany won World War II? How would that have changed motorcycling? And there are some sort of obvious answers here, but there's some more nuanced stuff. And we reached out to our friend Matt Oxley, who joined us for the MotoGP Marc Marquez episode earlier this season. He is, of course, a very learned motorcycle historian. He had lots of interesting stuff to say. And I thought it was funny, Spurge, also that Chase pointed out that this question was like it started as a joke.
Right.
Like one of the producers in Philadelphia, our buddy Mike, he said, "Oh yeah, what if Germany won World War II? Then how would motorcycling change? You mean something like that?" And Chase was like, "Huh. That's actually pretty good. I'm going to put it on the list." And he was like, no, I was kidding.
Well, I think it's interesting because like even when we were doing pre-pro for this, like if you've never seen it, there was a TV show on the Sci-Fi Network called The Man in the High Castle, where it was actually like I think it ran for like 4 or 5 seasons, but it was the same thing. Like what if Germany won World War II? What would the world, what would America,
less
like?
Focused on motorcycles,
right?
I think.
Yeah. But I do think it was fun. What I was excited for, and the reason we picked Matt Oxley for this, is that Matt has written about post-World War II Europe and how it influenced motorcycles. And I'll be honest, Matt's response to this question was not what I thought it was going to be. And I am kind of glad for that, because it left my take on this, as a wide open lane, right. Being that Matt didn't, choose to drive down that path.
I think that I would like to pause quickly in this discussion of what if Germany won World War II, and say that the laughter, banter, and fun we were having with this is not in any way reflective of some of the obvious horrendous fallout that there would have been if Germany had won World War II. We don't think that we're not really going to touch on all of the ways that it would have been disrupted
a very negative implication on the world.
Exactly. We're not laughing or poking fun at anti-Semitism in any way. Obviously, that's not funny. But from an industrial and specifically motorcycling side of things, where do we think this would have led? And I think there are a few interesting discussions to be had. So, Spurge, you want to kick it off? You want to kick it off with what Matt thinks or what you think?
Let's start off with what Matt thinks. So, for those of you that might not be familiar, we've had Matt on the podcast in the past, depending on whether or not you're following along with season 11. We had Matt on to talk about his book for Mark the Magnificent. He is a historian. He is a MotoGP commentator. He runs his own podcast. He's somebody that has followed everything from the 20s and the foundation of motorcycling all the way through to current day. He was the perfect person to start out with. And Matt came back to us and said, and we're paraphrasing because Matt sent us quite a response. We'd probably all be riding around on BMW flat twins. and the other pivot that he made was, well, we'd probably be riding around on Autobahns, German freeways that, you can go as fast as you want to go. There's no speed limit. You can be blasted around 200 miles an hour if you'd like, as long as you do it in a responsible way. He gave us a story recently where he was driving down the Autobahn at 120, feeling like a rock star, and people were blowing by him. And he's like, holy hell, this is crazy. He also went on to pontificate that if the Nazis would have won the war, then most likely Japan would have won the war as well, because they were allies. And so in addition to things like the BMW flat twin being prevalent, you could have potentially also had, brands like Honda and Yamaha and Suzuki and Kawasaki come up to prominent power quicker or
sooner.
Yeah, sooner. Or maybe, and maybe this is kind of a pivot that I don't know if Matt was kind of completely thinking about. Maybe some of those brands would not have existed because, the reason some of those brands, got into motorcycling.
Hang on.
Sorry,
Are you talking about Matt's take here? Or are you talking about your take? You pivoting? You doing another pivot?
No, I'm not pivoting.
You like to pivot.
I'm saying that, one of the things that Matt threw out here was that these brands would have been massive, but what if they, I'll wait. You're right. It was going to be a pivot. Matt said, what if they were massive? I was going to throw a counterpoint out there.
Right. He points out that if one country, if Germany had won the war, then there would have been different outcomes elsewhere. And who knows what economic implications that would have had. Yeah. And I think that's a fair thing to point out. Spurge, this time I'm going to take the baton and I'm going to pivot.
Run for it.
Because we had the same take, I think. I think you were about to say the same thing I wrote down, which was, if Japan had come out, quote unquote, victorious from World War II as well, sure, you'd think, well, the Japanese big four motorcycling companies would have just been even more prevalent, right?
Right.
But what I wrote down in my notes, which I think is what you were reaching for, was it not the post-war austerity in Japan that spurred the motorcycle industry to some extent in Japan, right?
Say that in normal language that everybody can understand.
Because everything was so people had to use motorcycles, and that spurred a motorcycle industry and created innovation and industry and eventually machines that they could sell to Americans for cheap.
And also because Japan was not allowed to produce certain things after World War II.
Right.
Because of the implications that they couldn't go into industries that might have war application.
Right. And that's sort of like famously, I just, it might be a World War I thing, kind of think of it. Maybe misremembering this, but obviously BMW's logo is famously a propeller, right? Because it was an aircraft company to some extent, and then was disallowed from doing that because they were like, y'all can't be trusted with flying stuff right now because you keep invading people. And so they were like, all right, we'll make these things with wheels on them. It's less exciting, but we can do that too. And so, yeah, all these things, all these like little tweaks to what seems like a small thing, like, oh, well, not a small thing, what seems like a simple, editing of history, right? It's sort of like, well, what if World War II just went differently? That's easy enough to say and easy enough to imagine. But sometimes the fact that it went a certain way was what turned the industry or the economy upside down in exactly the right way to create these companies that then later flourished for different reasons, right? Is that fair to say?
That is fair to say.
Okay, now I feel like this history teacher Spurge. Mr. Dunbar, will you tell us, please, what you think about all this?
So here's my pivot. And this is what I thought Matt was going to say. So Matt wrote a book called Stealing Speed. It was my first experience reading Matt's work. Back in 2019, Mark Gardner wrote an article for us reviewing a graphic novel version of Stealing Speed.
That was the one I read.
That is up on Common Tread. And you can head over to Common Tread now and read about motorcycling's Cold War spy story, Stealing Speed. It's a true story. And Matt did the research to bring this to us. And here's the too long didn't read version. After World War II, Germany, Berlin specifically, Germany gets split into half, right? And there's East Germany and there's West Germany,
and for those not familiar, there was a wall.
There was a wall in Berlin, specifically, and the piece of this is in East Germany is ruled by the Soviets, and it falls under communist rule. And there's a little motorcycle company that was DKW, and that becomes MZ. And there's an engineer there named Walter Kaden, and Walter worked on the V2 rocket project under Nazi Germany. And Matt goes on to explain in his book that, Walter wasn't really a Nazi. He didn't believe in the Nazi, propaganda and BS, but he just liked being a scientist. And so he developed
and the Nazis had the money and they had the rockets, and he wanted to work on rockets.
And so he developed a V2, or he was part of the development of the V2 two-stroke rocket project. Nazis lose the war. And in the 1950s, he's sitting around his little workshop building motorcycle engines. And in 1954, they're producing these two-stroke motorcycle engines with this rocket technology. And those little 1954 engines produced roughly 100 horsepower per liter. Fast forward, 5 or 6 years, those same engines are producing 200 horsepower per liter. Walter develops the expansion chamber, disc valve induction. He takes two-stroke technology and he turns it into something that is very important in the world of motorcycling. And then in the end of 1961, Ernst Degner, who was a co-engineer on the project, but also the one racing these motorcycles for MZ, defects. He and his family are smuggled out of the country. And where do they go, Zach? What country do they go to in 1961?
Nippon.
What?
Japan?
Oh, I didn't. Yeah, I thought you said something else. But yes, Japan is the answer. And by 1962, Suzuki has this two-stroke technology. They're winning races. And the rest is pretty much history. There's a lot more to the story. You should read the book if you haven't. But the point being is because this East Bloc, Soviet-controlled post-World War II motorcycle company had no hope of all of the four-stroke innovation and technology that other manufacturers were playing with. They had to use the technology that they had at their fingertips and revolutionize it to go out and win races. And they do it. They do it wildly successfully. Nobody sees it coming. And then that technology goes on to power MotoGP up until when did two strokes?
2000.
2000?
2001. Yeah.
So for roughly 40 years, two-stroke technology becomes like the prominent force in motorcycle racing. Would that have happened if the Germans would have won the war? Probably not. And I think when we think about that,
what's the alternate reality that you see there then, Spurge? Like DKW, and because Matt pointed out in his note to us that DKW was at some point around that time, or just pre-war maybe, was the biggest motorcycle manufacturer in Europe.
Right.
And so do you think DKW or MZ then becomes this, or that they share that technology with BMW? BMW starts making two strokes. We don't know. Or maybe DKW and MZ they become this world power and they start winning the Isle of Man TT and they start winning GP events.
I think maybe they wouldn't have focused on this little non-performing technology. They wouldn't have wasted time trying to figure out how to double the horsepower of a two-stroke motor. They would have focused on four-stroke innovation, right?
I see.
So like maybe
because they would have been living the lap of luxury.
Yeah.
They would have been all superchargers and thick steak for dinner.
Boeing would be producing jet-powered motorcycles in an alternate universe. But seriously, I think the question becomes, we still have diehard two-stroke fans in the off-road world. Imagine imagine anybody riding around in a KTM engine without an expansion chamber on it, right?
So, which is, to be clear, sorry to interrupt you, but quick sidebar. That's what two-strokes were for a long. Two-stroke technology had been around for a very long time, decades. And they were these simple little things that were very dirty and unsophisticated. And they just sort of chugged along. And it wasn't until to your point, Spurge,
Walter Caden.
Right. It wasn't until Caden, till someone figured out how to harness the
potential,
the waves of energy in the exhaust system and create expansion chambers that two-strokes really became such a force.
So I doubt that they would have invested in like, hey, here's what we're going to do. Take this antiquated technology and figure out a way to improve it. Because they wouldn't have done, they probably wouldn't have gone down that road. They probably would have gone down the road of taking what's already performing and evolving it, you know?
Right.
Matt, why was that not Matt's? I'm glad, but I'm also very surprised that Matt didn't think about it from the point of view of his own book.
Well, he also had some other interesting notes, I thought. One of which, just to change gears a little bit, was that German engineering goes back a long, long way. The reason that Germany has this reputation, I think currently, but certainly over the past number of decades, I don't know, as being an engineering hotspot and hub in the world, goes back to Matt's estimation to the 15th and 16th centuries, where there were guilds that were created to protect the crafts of the craftsmen. You had to be a member in order to be, you had to be sort of subject to exams and licenses to be, it goes way back to metallurgy and creating things. And the German sort of like culture and structure supported that. And it grew into what we know it to be today, whether, you know, whatever, Mercedes and Audi and Porsche and so on and so forth. But it goes back a really long way. Another thing, to change gears yet again, that he pointed out was that Hitler was anti-motorcycle because he was pro-family. He didn't want dudes in leather jackets, you know, bopping around from you know, town to town, rolling in the hay with the fair maidens. He wanted Volkswagen Beetles with 2.2 kids in them so that they could grow up and fight a war for him, presumably. But, you know, he didn't like that. And so that's another interesting facet of this, that just like, there's just umpteen different ways you could take that.
But the other piece of that Matt pointed out too, was that at the time, German motorcycle racers were not allowed, like there was no expectation of failure, right? So they were expected to go out and lay it on the line. He
gave us a quote. It was sort of like a German, or was it a BMW? Maybe it was BMW specifically. It was like, or maybe it was that NSKK club that he talked about, the motorcycle racing club. I forget. But he basically said, you're not allowed to be afraid. That's like the rule of like being a racer for this organization. You're not allowed to be afraid.
And you're not, and essentially you will put it all out there. And like, if you have to die for the sport, like you'll go out and you'll you know, end it. And I think, think about just that. If like that was the mentality of like, you know, the sport and winning at all costs becomes like, you know, the feature of motorcycle racing, would we have had safety, innovation, and technology evolve the same way?
That's a good question. It's interesting to me to think about, you know, BMW obviously is the most obvious German brand to bring up in the context of a motorcycle podcast. And BMW has done a pretty good job, I think. You know, maybe they were slow on the uptake with certain things, and maybe they innovated in certain ways. But if you look at BMW's lineup now, it's pretty broad, and they've done the thing that longtime listener Jay wished that Harley did, right? Which is like branch out in all these directions. And there were people when BMW came out with an inline 4 superbike that were sort of like, that's not a BMW. That's not what that is. I don't recognize that as the BMW that I know, you know, probably people felt the same way about a Porsche SUV or something like that. I don't know. But it's been a boon for the company, and the BMW has shown that it is, you know, willing to sort of like take the Honda path and just be like, we'll build whatever kind of engine we think will work and be awesome and sell. Which I think is,
and Porsche's selling a lot of SUVs.
So Porsche's selling a lot of SUVs. Yeah, exactly right. I think obviously, again, there are just 1,004 different ways that we could take this whole hypothesis on you know, what if World War II went differently. But it is I I don't know. It's interesting to, I guess the little vignettes that I took away from Matt's digestion of this question that we gave him was sort of like, imagine an Autobahn across Iowa and lots of BMW flat twins, which is sort of like easy to say and easy to imagine quickly. But to your point about the expansion chamber and the two-stroke technology, and to the point that I brought up about the economic realities in Japan,
post-war,
arguably creating some of the companies that we still know today. It's like, I don't know. It's one of those things you might not want it to go a different way just because we're attached to the way that it is now.
I want to move on in the sake of time, but like, I believe wasn't Ducati the same way? Wasn't Ducati like, weren't they kind of forced to, they were making like radios or something like that.
Radios, yeah.
And then they couldn't do that because of like wartime technology or something like that. And they were kind of forced to.
Oh yeah, you might be right. And then and I think they put a little engine in on a bicycle, basically, that like sort of you could putt around on. And yeah, maybe that's true. That sort of rings a bell. I'm not going to pretend that I know the full history of Ducati off the top of my head. Right. I would like to end with something that Matt ended with, which I talked about in the beginning here, which is the sort of maybe more somber recognition of what the world would have looked like if Germany had won World War II. He pointed out, historian that he is, that DKW, a company that we talked about before, had a star rider as the Nazis rose to power, by the name of Seinweg, maybe. I'm not sure exactly how to spell it or say it. And he was Jewish and fled to the Netherlands because of persecution. And he was hid in someone's house to try to avoid persecution, and was found and was sent to Auschwitz and was murdered. Perfectly good motorcycle rider and citizen of the world. Yeah. And I think that's an important thing to remember in this sort of hypothetical situation that we had a lot of fun laughing and yelling about, is that probably for the best that didn't go that way.
And probably for the best that, for the sake of time, we talk about safety, right? So we pontificated, Indeed. What would safety evolved with if the Germans had won the war, but what would a truly safe motorcycle look like? And this is a question that came in from one Ari Henning, and he says, it seems like the obvious answer is the car, but it could be fun to explore the ways that motorcycles' inherent risks could be mitigated, i.e., what if we had extra wide wheels to add stability? What if there was some sort of protection from impacts, a restraint system for riders, etc.? So, Zach, who did we want to reach out to ask the question, can you build a truly safe motorcycle?
This seemed like a fun challenge for our old buddy Ryan F9. And he came back to us with a fun couple paragraphs, sort of working this all out in his brain. And I'm going to blow up our plan a little bit here, Spurge, and say this is what he ultimately said. He said, I would choose big pontoons attached to the motorcycle. Basically, car bumpers can detect collisions in 10 milliseconds, and there's no reason that a motorcycle's extremities couldn't be made to do the same. Have that signal a fire for an airbag system. And I don't just mean a chest airbag, by the way, that we're currently using, like Tech Air we talked about earlier, but some sort of like 3-foot thick bubble that envelops the whole rider, like an instant car size marshmallow, to take the impact around a rider if such an impact occurred. The thing that he settled on, Spurge, which I think needs to be brought up at this point, was he had another great quote where he said, there's just no good way to pit 500 pounds against 5,000 pounds. And that is ultimately in the few paragraphs that he sent us, where he sort of chewed this over in his mind and said, well, you could do this, or you could do that, but that wouldn't work. You have to do this. Ultimately, what he pointed out very rightly, because he's a smart guy, is that you got a small vehicle, you got a big vehicle. If you have a car hitting a motorcycle or a motorcycle hitting a car or whatever it is, the motorcycle and rider is just lighter and smaller, and the lighter, smaller thing in the world of physics takes the hit harder.
Right.
And so all of the ways that you would try to come up with a way to make a motorcycle really, really safe, is trying to combat that physical fact.
And one of the examples that he gave, and I thought this was really interesting because, when I first started thinking about this as a question, I immediately kind of gravitated in a similar direction to what he went about with the BMW C1, which if you've never seen before, it was like a BMW scooter, but with like a whole roll cage around it and a windshield. And I believe it even had seatbelts.
Yeah. Imagine sort of like a car bucket seat with a handlebar in front of it. And so like a scooter, imagine a scooter, but with a high back seat. And then from the headlight to the taillight, imagine like a piece of like a roll bar / windshield in front of you. They're still around sometimes. If you travel in Europe at all, you might see them parked somewhere. They're kind of funny looking. They got windshield wiper on them. But yeah, you can still stick your arms and legs out the side of the bike, but you have a canopy over the top of you and theoretically some protection.
And for those of you that are listening on Spotify or YouTube with the video, you won't have to imagine. We'll make sure there's a photo of it up there. But that's where when I started thinking about this question for myself, it was like, okay, that's where I'm going in my mind. But Ryan went on to point out that while there was a lot of success with this particular C1, if it glanced off a car, it could kind of, easily bop away a little bit, maybe easier than a traditional motorcycle. But that's where he got into the point of like, if there was a head-on collision, and it wasn't just a glance off, that 500 pounds versus 5,000, the motorcycle, whether it's a C1 with a cage around it or not, is most likely going to lose that battle. With automotive, so much of the engineering goes into like the crumple zone and like how much of the impact can be taken by the vehicle itself, not the person driving the vehicle.
Right. And he did point out crumple zone. He was sort of like, you could have a crumple zone, some sort of like big thing that sticks out in front of a motorcycle. So if you hit anything, you don't hit quite as hard. But then he rightly said that's like too hard to to rationalize, really. And he talked about seatbelts, like attaching the rider to the motorcycle is like good in some ways and very bad in some ways. So what I think what I came around to, like I love his idea of the big car size marshmallow, right? That just goes whap and like inflates and is around the rider. Sort of like it reminds me of like avalanche airbags. Have you ever seen those that just sort of like create a cocoon around the person? Something like that, except made for impact and less for compression and snow and whatever. But I'm gonna just change course for a minute here. I'm gonna circle back to it. I promise. Did you ever watch Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote Roadrunner cartoons when you were a kid, Spurge? Or maybe you still watch them?
Yeah, that's all I watch.
So one of the things that bothered me, even as a child, about the Coyote is that Coyote would come up with these schemes, right? He'd have all this like equipment set up. He's like, I'm going to catch this Roadrunner. And he would do this thing and have this mechanism set up with a little sling and a bungee and a set of wheels. And like, I'm going to trap him and he's going to go into the net and then I'm going to get him. And then like some freaking 1 in a million thing would happen. And the bungee cord would wrap itself around his tail and it would sling him against the rock and slam him. And then the vehicle would hit him. And in my mind, I always thought, Coyote, that wasn't that bad an idea to begin with. You just got a little bit unlucky. I think if you just went back to the drawing board and tried that same thing again, but of course that's not the nature of the cartoon and that's not the nature of the Coyote. Coyote always had a new idea.
He was buying Acme products. He should have changed brands, Where I'm going with this is the BMW C1, I don't think was designed necessarily to be, I don't think safety was the point. I think it was more comfort, for, keeping yourself out of the rain, whatever. Yeah.
But to me, it's interesting to think that the BMW C1 was produced, in a time when airbags weren't a thing. Well, sorry, airbags existed, but airbag technology in a personal motorcycling sense has come a long way since then.
Right.
And it's interesting. And even like curtain airbags in cars have come a long way since then. It's interesting to me to Ryan's point, sort of, if you took a BMW C1, if you took a scooter or any motorcycle, any two-wheeled vehicle that represents scootering or motorcycling or whatever, and you put a canopy over the top of it, and then you built airbags into the whole thing so that if you were hit from behind, or if you hit anything in front of you, or if you hit from the side, an airbag would go off and envelop the whole thing in this 3-foot thick car-sized marshmallow, as he put it. And I don't think that that's something that anyone's working on, really. And maybe it's because motorcycles are dangerous and that's why we all like them and whatever. I don't know if there's other subconscious things we want to talk about, but I think it's curious that vehicle existed in a time when the airbag technology wasn't up to date. And now that airbag technology has come to date, no one circled back around to that. Like the Coyote, like go back to that idea, Coyote. It wasn't that bad an idea, especially if we have the
slingshot, strap yourself to a rocket,
right.
Call Boeing. Here's where I kind of landed with this. Right now, the top options for safety that we have are, and Ryan pointed this out, are wearable airbags. And those are derived from what? Where did we first see wearable airbags come into play, Zach?
Las Vegas casinos.
Motorcycle racing. Good answer.
Yes. Yeah, that's what I meant to say. Shoot. God,
so
stupid.
The safety technology that we are using on the street is derived from motorcycle racetracks. If you're on a motorcycle racetrack, the type of crash that you're going to have is very different than the type of crash that you're going to have on the street, right? And
potentially.
Potentially. But here, follow along with me here. What you're not seeing evolve from motorcycle racing per se is adaptive cruise control. You don't have adaptive cruise control on race bikes because that's not presumably something you would want, but that's technology we see on the street. And for those of you that aren't familiar, adaptive cruise control in the world is sensors that can tell how far a vehicle is in front of you or potentially behind you, and it adjusts the speed automatically if it senses that you're getting too close to a vehicle in front of you. So where I landed with this wasn't motorcycle wearable airbags are not the way to move forward, or hey, to your point about the Coyote, we tried an airbag in a Goldwing 10, 15 years ago and it didn't work. So we just didn't evolve that technology.
Right.
What I think is the way forward for a more safe motorcycle is we started this podcast talking about the data and the accelerometers and the gyroscopes that are built in to an Alpinestars airbag. What if the Alpinestars airbag talked to the motorcycle adaptive sensors? So on a racetrack, if you're too close to the rider in front of you, the last thing you want to have happen is for the airbag to go off prematurely. That's gonna screw up your race day, right? Like you're supposed
right.
to be close and banging handlebars and everything else. But rolling down the 405 freeway, you don't want to be that close to the person in front of you. So if there was a way for the sensors on a motorcycle to be the car bumpers that you and Ryan are kind of talking about here. Uh-huh. And if it's coming up along a vehicle or an item in front of you too quickly, and it can sense that the impact is imminent, or if there's something coming at you from the side and the sensor's like, oh, you don't want something coming at you that way, that fast. Uh-huh. It triggers the wearable airbag to go off. And if there is an impact, it allows you to be propelled off the motorcycle. The reason that we don't have seatbelts on motorcycles, to Ryan's point, is that you do not want to come to a full stop against a 5,000-pound truck. You want to fly off and get as far away as possible. And that's where the airbag goes off and you survive the impact. So that's how I see this being a potential realistic evolution forward, is that Alpinestars airbag that you're wearing and that, Ducati adaptive cruise control sensor is expanded. And now all of a sudden, and Ducati's not the only one, I'm just using them as an example. But now they talk to each other, and now that airbag can go off much sooner.
Okay.
And honestly, in that situation, if ultimately you slam on the brakes hard enough and you don't come to an impact, but your airbag goes off. Like, inconvenient, but let's be honest, probably better the airbag go off and you not need it than the alternative.
Okay. I don't hate that. I don't hate it. And I know that for what it's worth, I think it was Bosch years and years ago now. I'm probably still working on it, talking about, connective communication technology between vehicles so that, to your point, that kind of thing could be more realistic. Like the motorcycle that you're riding has this, call it Connect Link, whatever. And then, every car that's sold has Connect Link. And then when you're coming up to an intersection around a blind curve on a foggy night, your motorcycle knows there's a car there. And so it's not going to initiate an airbag deployment, not yet anyway, but it knows, it can tell you, like there can be a signal on the dash or something. There can be like, car ahead or something like that. And that's how Bosch imagined it years ago. And obviously that's just one situation in a theoretically a rural place, and it's really different than riding around in a city, blah, blah, blah. But yeah, I think you're onto something. I still I'm still attaching myself to Ryan's idea of the car-sized marshmallow and
inflating itself around the rider,
but yeah, the old giant marshmallow.
It's almost lunchtime for Zach, so he's got marshmallows on the brain.
That's right, marshmallows on my mind. Yeah, it's true. All right. Well, perhaps, like I said, trying to imagine ways that motorcycles could be as safe as possible ultimately gets us to a vehicle with four wheels and a cage around it, and we sort of just back away from that slowly because that's not why we're here. Well, and
I think that there's something to that too.
All right, moving on. The final hypothetical comes directly from producer Chase himself. He wanted to know, what if internal combustion engine motorcycles were banned tomorrow? What if gas-powered bikes are just whatever, in the interest of trying to save Americans from all of the horrors of motorcycling, Congress passes the No More Ice Bikes Act, and alternative fuel motorcycles and bicycles are okay, but gas-powered motorcycles are not okay. Gas-powered trucks, semi-trucks, big ships, your hybrid Prius, still fine. Gas-powered motorcycles, no longer. You're not allowed to have them anymore. This is the hypothetical.
And one of the examples that we pulled where this isn't potentially as far-fetched as some people might think is that back in 2016, Lance Oliver penned an article about Paris's ban on old motorcycles begins next month. So for those of you living in Paris, you might be more familiar with this, but basically Paris created a law where motorcycles produced before the year 2000 are banned. You can't ride them anymore. Not inside the city limits.
Right. And I think there's like maybe similar stuff going on in traffic laws in like London. There's like congestion charges, and there's sort of like certain places where you're not allowed to bring certain cars. Isn't that true? I don't know.
Mexico City, New Delhi, really Lance references other cities around the world that are toying around with ideas like this. So in a country like America, where motorcycling is a minority practiced hobby, it is not inconceivable that, the government would say, hey, you know what? We don't want to deal with this anymore. In an effort to reduce pollution, no more internal combustion engines for motorcycles. You got to figure out something else. And who did we ask about this one, Zach?
This one we put to Mr. Spencer Robert because he's got a keen imagination. And
he also just bought an electric motorcycle.
I think he already sold it, actually.
Oh, did he? Okay.
But yes, he did. He did have an electric motorcycle in his, it was actually a Livewire one, I think, wasn't it? Anyway, that he had in his garage for a few months there, but I think it might be gone already. Anywho, he knows a thing or two about a thing or two. And he had some interesting thoughts here. There's lots of places your mind can go here. Like, what if internal combustion bikes were made illegal? Well, then there'd be like this underworld where
Spencer was talking about Star Wars. He went down a deep Star Wars Jedi gas bike.
I like that. Yeah. There's sort of like this underground culture of like, we're going to race at midnight with really, really, fast motorcycles, but really, really good mufflers so that no one can hear them. That kind of thing. Anyway,
I can see him writing a CTXP about this already in his mind, where he's like, guys, here's what we're going to do.
The conclusion he came to was, and I quote, "I love gas bikes. I love how they sound, how they feel, how they smell. But I love the freedom and excitement of being on two wheels way more than I love any specific byproduct of burning gasoline." And I think most riders would agree, whether they realize it or not. And so he went on to say, that, the people who really love riding would get electric bikes, would get something electric. And would we rue the day because we miss the sound that they make, or like the power they have, or something like that? Maybe. But I think it's a pretty obvious conclusion to jump to. And I think he jumped to it in exactly the right way, which is that people who actually care about it would still do it. They would just find an alternative fuel. So you'd have your wind powered motorcycles, your electric motorcycles, your what else can you power something with? Spurge?
Well,
I don't know.
I think that's a perfect segue into where my mind went with this.
Hit me.
Which I think oftentimes we, as a society, and we like, I'm going to use a music example, right? So like, records were inefficient, so we developed cassette tapes. Cassette tapes, you had to fast forward and rewind, but they were more portable than records. And then all of a sudden we got the CD, and let's ignore mini discs and other things. But then we got the CD, right? And CDs were portable like a cassette deck, but you could skip song to song like a record. And that was the prominent technology. And then it went into MP3s. And so my point being is that like, you didn't have two competing forces at one time. Basically the industry said, "Hey, this is what we're going to do. This is what we're going to focus on, and let's move forward." And you're seeing that a little bit. Which is to say, like cassette tapes and CDs existed at the same time, surely. But you're saying that like the industry had agreed on a way to move forward. Is that what you're saying? Exactly.
Okay.
And until that technology is proven inefficient with the way MP3s kind of came to power, there was no reason to change. And so what's interesting with the internal combustion engine is that for years it's evolved, but the fundamental technology hasn't had a reason to change. And then some of the environmental implications were coming around, and it was like, well, let's think about electric. Can we build something better? Can we build something that doesn't pollute? And everybody just kind of went with this, electric will be the next thing. And it kind of almost stopped some of the exploration and innovation.
Is this when you circle back to the Boeing jet bike again?
I'm not going to circle back to the Boeing jet bike. That still requires fuel. But one of the articles that Dustin Whelan wrote back in 2023 was that there was a study that finds that lithium mining for EV batteries is unsustainable in the long scheme of things, and the environmental implications of that.
Right.
And so I believe it was Toyota that came out and said, we're actually just going to produce hybrids because we can produce, 11 hybrids for the same, environmental impact of one electric vehicle. So there's already this debate happening here. But my point in this whole rambling mess is that why electric motorcycles? We already know that the big four, Kawasaki, Suzuki, Honda, and Yamaha, are challenging themselves to build a hydrogen-powered bike. And so far, they haven't had any reason to really do it. It's kind of like plodding along.
I see.
Kawasaki did showcase an engine at Suzuka back in 2024. So but I haven't heard anything more about it since 2024. And so maybe internal combustion engines being banned is the catalyst to say, you know what? Running full electric is probably not going to be the way this is going to work out long term, whether that's for environmental implications or just sustainability or range anxiety or whatever. But what if the big four take all of the effort that they've been putting into internal combustion engines and saying, you know what, we're going to finally solve this in a way that makes sense and is reasonable.
Okay. Yeah. In other words, the thing that we pointed out about post World War II Japan and how the state of that nation maybe propelled a motorcycle industry forward, perhaps something like this would change the outlook that everyone had on what the options are for creating propulsion. Why are we looking at steam?
But
steam worked pretty well. Steam got people across those plains way back when.
Let's just throw some coal in an engine, let that produce the steam, and then chugga. But let me ask you a question. In your research for this, in your pontification, and in looking at Spencer's response and thinking outside the box, and I was guilty of this for my first round of thoughts, but like, did you just kind of resolve yourself to like, okay, well, we don't have internal combustion engines. Are people going to buy electric bikes? Is that where your mind went?
Yeah, of course, because that's the only option right now. Because there is another option, right? And it's sitting there waiting in the wings. And there's a very obvious case to be made that if you just said no more gas-powered motorcycles, like they're all banned from the streets, then the first thing you reach for is the thing that has been slowly developing on the side, right? So yeah, I think that's where my mind went right out of the gates. But there is, there's always innovation happening, and I think that you're right that that something else could come to the fore, come to fruition. I do think that it's fair to point out, especially the way that motorcycling sits in American society, that it would be by and large a death knell for it all, right? Because the industry would eventually recover to some extent, but like it wouldn't, there's not enough necessity for people to need it. And therefore there's not enough demand for there to be supply. It would just be people who really didn't want to let go of it because they loved it or whatever.
But I think that's where my mind went from. Like, I saw it as, so take my hydrogen pivot off the table. And, my initial thought to you was, electric. Okay. Who wins? And I think there's enough brands out there that have already invested in this where
invested in electric, you mean?
Yeah. Like, I do think, to your point about, for America, it's an enthusiast based piece, who just gives it up and says, I don't feel like dealing with this versus who wants to keep pushing forward. And I think you have brands like Zero or Stark, or, even, KTM or Can-Am, for example, like Can-Am revamped, starting with electric, where it's like they could probably continue, and actually they might have more success. Livewire might start selling more motorcycles because now you can't go out and buy a big twin Harley. You can't go out and buy a Sportster. And so maybe what the alternate universe here is that 10 years down the road, Stark, Zero, Can-Am, and Livewire are your biggest brands, with Honda, Kawasaki, KTM, and BMW trying to catch up. And I list those because KTM, Honda, Kawasaki, and BMW are already dabbling in EV motorcycles. Yes,
they already have something for sale somewhere, somehow. Yeah, I think it's possible. Well, Spurg,
would you stop riding motorcycles if you had to switch to electric?
No. Yeah. I feel the same way Spencer does.
Yeah.
I love, I feel exactly the way he does. I like how they sound and how they feel and how they smell. And I love, the feel of a clutch, like learning a clutch and a transmission and all the things that you do on a gas powered bike that by and large you don't do on an electric bike. But I have fun on electric bikes, and I like the experience of, yes, as Spencer put it, the freedom and excitement of being on two wheels more than like the noise or the smell, that's the thing that I'm truly drawn to. And I would miss some of the byproducts of gas engines, but yeah. What about you? How do you feel about it?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be sharp. You'd
be first in line for a Can-Am.
I'd be shopping for a Stark. I'd be looking for used free rides. I'd be, checking out Can-Am. Like, yeah, 100%. I'd be excited to see if Zero could shave a few pounds off their adventure bike and make it something that's maybe a little bit more hardcore adventure focused. I think there's a ton of ideas, but I do think, where I ultimately landed with this is, would this encourage manufacturers to think outside, not just internal combustion engine, but think outside electric and bring alternatives to market that might make more sense, not just for the motorcycling industry, but for the real true evolution of transportation moving forward.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's an interesting question. And yeah, I mean, I think ultimately that stuff hasn't been a necessity. So it hasn't been brought to the fore, right? To your point. I don't know exactly. I think I was listening to radio yesterday. I'm not sure how accurate this is, but I'm pretty sure a barrel of oil is like $60-something right now. It's not a big enough problem. As much as we talk about it, as much as you can lean into environmental issues, you can lean into this, that, and the other thing. I think that it's worth considering or worrying about impacts that we have on the planet, or whether or not things are sustainable, whether it's digging lithium out of the ground or digging oil out of the ground. But the truth is, it's not a big enough problem now, right?
Can I ask you a question? Because I know that you said you were listening to this stat. I too, in preparation for this, was doing some outside research, and part of what I was looking at was the automotive industry and the rollbacks that we've had in EV in America because of, current administrations not prioritizing EV incentives. And so a lot of auto manufacturers are now kind of saying, you know what, maybe we'll just stick with internal combustion engines for a while. On average, how many barrels of oil are we bringing in from Canada per day? You just talked about $60 a barrel. How many millions of barrels are we bringing in one day from Canada?
12.
4.
Okay.
So you went really big.
I didn't have any idea.
4 million barrels per day. And Canadian oil is primarily used to refine for diesel fuel, right? Like there's different grades of oil and how it gets refined. But my point is, like, I heard that number and I was like, I had to rewind the podcast I was listening to. And I was like, no, that has to be like 4 billion a year, 4 million a month, or 4 million barrels of oil per day.
That's a lot of barrels.
That blew my mind. I just had no idea.
Okay. Well, since we're talking about refining Canadian oil, we've obviously gotten way off track. Spurgeon, would like to thank Spencer Robert, Ryan Fortnine, Ari Henning, producer Chase, Matt Oxley, producer Mike, editor Matt, Patrick Garvin, and our old buddy Mark Cook for and longtime listener Jay for all of the contributions to this podcast. I had fun chewing this stuff over, and something tells me it'll be a bit of a dog whistle for anyone who knows about history or economics or aviation or barrels of oil to write in and say, you idiots, you forgot to blah, 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 and you got this thing wrong. And no, it wasn't DKW. It was whatever. So feel free, please, to correct us or pontificate, as Spurge likes to say, on your own time, and send an email to us at highside@RevZilla.com. We'd be happy to hear from you.
And if I used pontificate too much and I was unaware of it, I apologize. You can, maybe we make that part of the drinking game, the Highside Lowside drinking game moving forward. Every time Spurgeon says pontificate, you have to take a drink. But we currently live in a world where internal combustion engines do exist, and they are the majority power source for how we ride around on two wheels. And if you want your internal combustion engine to sound a little bit better, a little bit throatier, a little bit louder and more powerful, well, you should consider an Akrapovic exhaust. An Akrapovic exhaust is not just a premium exhaust for your motorcycle. An Akrapovic exhaust is also a key reason why we get to play this game, the engine sound guessing game, brought to you by Akrapovic, where Zach and I go toe-to-toe trying to guess the engine sound that is about to ring out in your eardrums.
Indeed. So here we go. We're going to hear an engine start up, run for a minute, rev a couple times, maybe even shut off, and we're going to try and guess what the heck it is. Please shout it out if you know it, everybody. That's one velvety engine there.
I was about to say velvety. Oh, look, you and I are on the same wavelength today, old buddy. I tell you.
We are.
Oh.
All right, Spurge. Well, what do you got?
How many cylinders do you hear, Zach?
I hear two.
Two.
So we agree?
I agree.
Okay. And are these cylinders parallel to each other, or are they in a V formation? And if so, Mr. Dunbar, what is the angle of the V?
So I'm hearing a V formation.
Mm-hmm.
I do not think I'm hearing a stock muffler.
Okay.
Like you said, velvety, but it sounds like it's muffled appropriately.
I would say so.
I'm afraid of saying, my gut reaction is that it's not a Harley engine, and I'm not sure if that's what you were driving at with the degrees of V.
No, but not specifically. I wasn't driving at Harley. I was just, that's the clue, obviously, if you can say, oh, it sounds like it sounds like a wider V or a narrower V, then that gives you a clue on what the type of bike is. But yeah, I don't know, man. It's a tricky one. I think I hear a V2, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's like, oh, it's actually a parallel twin. LOL. It's the 1992 Yamaha TDM. And this is what it sounded like. And I'd be like, son of a, I don't know.
I know Harleys are 45 degrees. What is Indian use? Do you know?
Well, it varies a little bit, but I think the big twins are 52.
52. Okay.
So they're a little wider splay because, they give themselves a little bit more room for the pistons not to hit themselves in the crankcase.
I can tell you what I didn't hear. So, I used to own a KTM V twin. Was it the LC8 that they called it?
Yeah, I think any 8-valve liquid cooled KTM is called LC8.
Yeah, and those were 75 degrees, I believe.
Yes.
And then there was like there was a 90 degree V twin from Ducati or Suzuki or Honda. I did not hear that. I didn't hear performance V twin.
No, that's the other thing we should call it here is that's real lopey, right? And I don't know if it's just the way the person's revving it, but it's very slow to rev. It's very kind of like, it's very, lopey and slow to rev. That's all I can say. And so it doesn't have the sort of like quick, engine. It doesn't spin up quickly, which sort of would hint at a performance engine. This sounds like something that is a more mellow type of motorcycle. I feel like it's going to be hint number 2 that we're going to need to look at here. Well, why don't you read hint number 1 and we can take it from there. But I think hint number 1.
Before I read hint number 1, my mind automatically went to Harley-Davidson, Moto Guzzi, or Indian. But then I'm also thinking about the fact that we talked about a Honda Shadow in this episode, and that's a V twin as well. But let's go. Yeah, let's go to the hints.
It's not a Harley. I feel pretty confident about that.
Hint number 1, son of a Chase, V twin.
Okay,
so we're
let's
on the right.
Let's do hint number 2,
and then listen to it,
and then listen to it again.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hint number 2 is our final hint. Remember, we get 2 hints. Hint number 2. Let me scroll down. Hold on one second. All right. According to the owner that sent in this engine sound, this motorcycle has, and I quote, a Euro 4 engine modified with a Mistral catalyzed mid-pipe and an aluminum aero end can DB killer installed. Producer Chase, this is a horrible hint. This does nothing for us.
He wants to see us twist in the wind.
According to the owner, this motorcycle has a Euro 4 engine modified with a Mistral catalyzed mid-pipe and an aluminum aero end can.
This is classic motorcycle owner thing to be like, tell us about your motorcycle. And like, well, I put this exhaust on it. And I'm like, no, I'm asking about your motorcycle, not about your exhaust. Anyway, okay, well, let's get one more listen here.
Well, hang on. Euro 4 means that this would be an older engine, right?
I like your Moto Guzzi guess. So let's give it another listen. Shall we, Spurge? Let's do it one more time here. I like your Moto Guzzi guess. That my mind went there too. And I feel confident in guessing a Moto Guzzi model, but like when you get into like low PV twins, it could so easily be like a Suzuki Boulevard or like a.
Hang on. So let's think about let's think about the hint for a second.
Let's psychoanalyze producer.
No, hold on. So okay. I don't know what the hell a Mistral catalyzed mid pipe is, but it doesn't sound like something that you're going to find on an Indian or a Suzuki or anything else. An aluminum aero end can. And honestly, the fact that he's saying end can instead of muffler, I'm guessing this might be a European individual with a European model. The fact that he's talking about a Euro 4 engine, I don't know any American that knows what standard Euro compliant engine they have in their motorcycle. I sure as hell don't. I am guessing, or not guessing, take guessing out of it. An Aero end can. Aero, for those of you listening, and I'm sorry to Akrapovich, who sponsors the Engine Sound Guessing Game. Aero is an exhaust manufacturer that competes with Akrapovich. They typically are making exhausts for European motorcycles in a general sense. They're not making exhausts they're not making an Aero performance exhaust for a Honda Shadow. It doesn't happen. So with that being said, if we're thinking about the fact that this has an Aero exhaust on it, I'm guessing it's a European bike.
But stop dragging your feet. Just guess already, will you? What are you saying?
I think it's a Moto Guzzi. I don't know what Moto Guzzi I think it is. It sounds a little bit bigger to me. It doesn't sound, but I'm also like Euro 4 is older. Like a Euro 4 is probably like
so it could be like a V11 or something.
Mid 2000s.
Okay.
I don't know. I don't know the Euro 4 years that it came in and out, but I'm saying.
So Moto Guzzi, for those of you that aren't familiar, is going to be a 90-degree V-twin, mounted transverse. So Ducati's V-twins are mounted longitudinally. Is that right? Well, anyway, sorry. Let me start again. The Moto Guzzi crankshaft is longitudinal. The cylinders are transverse. Cylinders stick out each side, sort of like a BMW, except it's a 90-degree V-twin instead of a 180 flat twin. Ducati is a 90-degree V-twin where the crankshaft is transverse, so the cylinders are point up and forward instead of out to each side. The point is, it's a 90-degree V-twin. 90-degree V-twins often sound similar to Spurgeon,
a parallel twin,
a parallel twin with a 270-degree crank pin offset.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Yes,
a motorcycle engine that has there are lots and lots of motorcycles. Right. In my mind, a motorcycle that has a 270-degree crank pin offset and is liable to have an Aero exhaust on it based on almost nothing in my mind is a Triumph.
Yeah, but we know it's a V-twin. The first hint was V-twin.
I thought it was just a twin.
No, first hint was V-twin. That's why I said we were on the right track.
Okay.
I think it's a Moto Guzzi. I don't know. I do not think it's a small Moto Guzzi. I think it's a bigger. I think it's one of the larger engines. The way it sounds,
right.
But I don't know enough about like which engines were used in which models in the 2000s to know which one this is. But I'm going Moto Guzzi, and I'm keeping mine generic.
Well, in the interest of keeping it fresh and exciting and fun, I'm going to say it's got to be a Moto Guzzi. I don't know.
It has. It's an Aero. It's not a Ducati. It's not a Ducati. It's not a Triumph because we know it's a V-twin.
Right.
And I'm thinking of like what brands are going to have an Aero exhaust on them.
An Aprilia V-twin, but it doesn't sound like an Aprilia V-twin to me.
Doesn't sound like an Aprilia V-twin.
Okay, let's just hear the answer here. We've dragged our feet long enough. We obviously don't know what it is.
Before I look at the answer, I would say one final note is that a Moto Guzzi V-twin is typically air-cooled, a little bit lopier, not a high-performance engine.
Yes, which is why we're drawn to it as an answer.
Okay, I'm going to scroll down.
Now tell us we're wrong.
Albert sent us a sound of his 2020 Moto Guzzi V85 TT.
Nice.
So that's a little bit newer than I guess my head was going, but I guess those engines are an evolution forward in Euro 4 technology. So a Moto Guzzi V85 TT, for the audience that might not be familiar, is Moto Guzzi's take on an adventure touring model. This is a large upright bug-eyed looking adventure touring bike.
Spencer Robert wrote a terrific article about riding around on a Moto Guzzi V85 TT. I suppose we could put that up on the screen right now, or you could search Common Tread for V85 TT. Spencer Robert, excellent article, or whatever you search for, and you'll find it. Anyway, that was a good one. It was fun. I wish we could have been more specific, but it gets tricky when you get down there. I'm proud of us for nailing down Moto Guzzi.
Not only am I proud of us, but I'm going to apologize to producer Chase, because in the end, it was his hint, which included aero exhaust, which allowed us
took you down
to go down a rabbit hole of like where I know aero exhausts are the bikes that I know aero exhausts are manufactured for, and the bikes that they are not manufactured for. So
love that. All right, we're going to move along.
No, not yet. Albert, want to thank you
Sorry.
Thank you for sending in your engine sound for us to play along to. Please do shoot us an email with your preferred Highside, Lowside t-shirt and size, as well as your mailing address, and we will get you a Highside, Lowside t-shirt out in the mail. If you too want to play the engine sound guessing game, send us your clip. We need the bike starting up, idling, a few good revs, and then idling again. Zach likes it if you shut the bike off for us so we can hear it shutting down, but now we're just splitting hairs.
So congratulations, Albert, and thank you very much for participating in our engine sound guessing game. And speaking of giving away t-shirts, it's time to do the Highside, Lowside comment/review. As a reminder, if we pick your comment/review/criticism of us, either as a comment on YouTube or Spotify, a Apple podcast review, or an email sent to highsidelowside@RevZilla.com, you too could win, and probably will win, a t-shirt of your choice. This one comes in from Lachlan. Lachlan says, and I quote, "I enjoyed episode 11 of season 10. In that episode, the fourth question you answered related to whether or not you could safely reverse the direction of your motorcycle tire on the rim/wheel. He goes on to compliment us on addressing listeners' question and prominent commercial manufacturer recommendations, blah, blah, blah. Lachlan says, I wanted to point out for the listeners' benefit that I don't even know how to say the name of this tire company, Spurg. Moto-Z? Moto-Z?
Moto-Z. Motaz or Moto-Z. I've heard it pronounced both ways.
This company sells a tire called the Dual Venture. And the front tire specifically, I think is the one that Lachlan's talking about, is bi-directional in design. So the front tire, you can swap it around and flip it on the rim and have it rotate the opposite direction. And the company is totally fine with that. And this might seem like advice that is far too specific for a general audience, but I think, Spurgeon and I agree that this is a great thing to call out, that we did not know about that tire specifically. And it's good to check recommendations of each tire manufacturer for stuff like this, because whether you're riding on a racetrack or riding an adventure bike or a dirt bike or whatever, the rules might be different and the manufacturer might in fact specify.
Here's the reason that I like this comment, Lachlan. Just because a manufacturer says that you can do something doesn't necessarily mean that you should do something. For anyone out there that's ever ridden an adventure tire on the street, and I've gone through a wide variety on different bikes and using different brands, because of the way that the knobs are set up and they're a little bit more aggressive in their tread pattern than a typical street tire. Even if you have the tire set appropriately from a PSI standpoint for air inside the tire, cupping tends to happen. By cupping, I mean the knobs wear away at an angle where you can get a little bit of chatter. You can feel a little bit of the tire vibration in the handlebars. The more aggressive the adventure tire, the more aggressive this happens. And I say that because I've got a set of Pirelli rally tires on my 890 right now, and it's pretty much the closest thing you can get to putting a street legal dirt bike tire on an adventure bike. And when I first started riding around, it was like, it took me a second to get used to, because it was like noticeably vibey. And I say this to say that if you start flipping adventure tires around after you've gotten some wear going, I have no idea how this is going to play out and feel for you And so it's not necessarily something that we're recommending that everybody out there do just because they say you can do it. If you're somebody that's sensitive to the vibration of the handlebar or how the tire handles when you're at a lean angle, there can be something here that is a bit off-putting.
Fair enough.
Think about, how often do you rotate the tires in your car? It's not like, well, at the halfway point, you get a 60,000 mile tire in your car, around 30,000 miles, swap around and see what happens. By that point, 2 of the 4 tires are pretty much going to be smoked. And then you're going to feel it adversely, in how you handle it. So you rotate your tires every 5,000 miles. And if you have an adventure bike tire where you're getting maybe 4,000 or 5,000 miles out of it, I don't think most people are going to be pulling their wheels off
every 600 miles.
Every 600
I got to flip it over.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's fair enough. But it remains a good comment, Lachlan, and your eligibility to get a free Highside Lowside t-shirt also remains. So please do send your preferred t-shirt design, size, and mailing address to highsidelowside@RevZilla.com. Spurgo, holy smokes. Did we talk about some hypotheticals today?
Hypotheticals.
I talked about the hypothetical that Triumph had a V-twin, because it was the hypotheticals episode.
And you didn't even know it. You're not paying. I think the only reason you're not more successful at the Engine Sound guessing game is you're clearly not paying attention to the hints close enough. And I think it's because you're just so talented at it. You don't even need the hints. So maybe moving forward, I'll just read the hints to myself. You play without the hints, and we'll see if we can't level the playing field a little bit here.
Right. Okie doke.
Biggest takeaway of the day, Zach. If you had to leave here today, thinking about anything, what would it be?
My big takeaway today is that Spurgeon Dunbar would ride around on a jet bike, and he thinks that Harley-Davidson is creating cutting-edge motorcycles. I did not see either one of those things coming.
I don't know if I'd ride around on a jet bike, but like the $100,000 flying drone looking helicopter bike, I'd play around with that. I'd play around with that. Yeah.
Good stuff. Okay. Well, what about you, Spurge? What was your big takeaway today? What was your big,
I just want to apologize, for my flub in the beginning. I was actually writing a Common Tread article, we into the night. And part of what I was doing for that was thinking about, different ways that we here in the Northeast survive the winter, as the wind chill was 8 degrees last night, and my fireplace was dying down, and I could feel that wind pushing down my chimney. And I was thinking, I'm not riding a motorcycle anytime this weekend. And I was thinking about, I was going down the rabbit hole of On Any Sunday, and I had Malcolm Smith on my brain, and I was talking earlier about airbags, and I said Malcolm Smith crashed, and you corrected me, and you said, no, you're talking about Malcolm Stewart. And I was like, ugh, somebody's going to ride this into the comment section and be like, what an idiot. But I just wanted to say, I was thinking about watching On Any Sunday this weekend. I believe it's the 55th anniversary of On Any Sunday coming out. And Malcolm Smith was a prominent figure in that movie. So if you're looking for something to do, and you're listening to this podcast, and maybe by the time this one comes out, it won't be as cold as it is today. But On Any Sunday is always a good watch in the winter months.
Well, the next time I watch On Any Sunday, I'm going to imagine Malcolm Smith with dreadlocks. That's all I have to say.
Picture him wearing an airbag.
That's right. And with that, everybody, we will let you get on with the rest of your day or night. And we'll hope to see you next time on Highside Lowside. Thank you so much for hanging out with us.
See y'all.